Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? The Matrix. Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
We all need to support the global goals.
Because of the experience we have with the pandemic, when health is at risk, everything is at risk.
The green recovery represents an unprecedented opportunity to rethink and reset the ways in which we live and do business.
We need a great reset.
The world's transition to net zero at the heart of how we operate. I'm afraid we are literally at the last hour, and there is real urgency for action. We know now what we have to do to rescue the situation, rather than going on talking about it.
I'm not going to talk about mandatory policy and where I stand on that point. It may well come up later, kind of hoping it does in the questions, because then I'll share with you my rather one-sided opinion on that. So what could be a better return on investment, Rob? What could we invest our resources in if we're not going to tackle hesitancy? If hesitancy is not to blame, how are we going to deal with this in the future? Well, I would argue that now is the time when we need a shift in perspective. Immunization is a best buy. 14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization. And when we talk about universal health coverage, we talk about primary health care, we talk about health security. Without immunization, there's none of that.
I want to tell you a little story of how we got where we are today. But to do so, we must go back in time. Let's go back first to 1798. The myth of overpopulation originated in England in 1798 when a vicar named Thomas Malthus, who fancied himself something of a mathematician, saw the food production increased incrementally, but people reproduced exponentially. So he sat down and did some simple math and summarily decided that the world would be out of food by 1890. He blamed reduced mortality rates and recommended killing off the have-nots of society. Otherwise, he claimed, the haves would starve to death. Now we go to London in the mid-1800s. And this story takes place in London, where a journalist gets a job at the New York Herald Tribune under the sponsorship and publishing of Horace Greeley. He was employed as a London correspondent. We are told that this foreign correspondent was so poor that his family were always very ill, and because of this they were undernourished. This journalist constantly appealed to Greeley and the then managing editor, Charles Dana, for an increase in his very generous at the time salary already of $5 per instalment, a salary which he and his good friend Frederick Ingalls devised a plan against the bourgeoisie, who he felt was cheating him. This journalist was no other than Karl Marx. So when all his financial appeals were refused, Marx looked around for other means of livelihood and fame, eventually leaving the Tribune and devoting his talents full-time to the writings of his works, one of them being the Communist Manifesto, which was also financed by Frederick Ingalls. The seeds of Leninism, Stalinism's revolution, and not forgetting the Cold War is down to this book. If only those greedy capitalists at the New York Herald newspaper had treated him more kindly, if only Marx had remained a foreign correspondent, history might have been different. Marxism is a philosophy, while communism is a system of government based on Marxist principles. Marx envisioned a society in which workers own the means of production. In real-world communism, though, governments own the mean of production. For Marx, the goal was the conquest of political power by workers, the abolition of private property, and the eventual establishment of a cashless, classless, and stateless communist society. In his writings, The Crisis of the Earth, Marx's theory of ecological sustainability as a nature-imposed necessity for human production. This work was essential to what we call today the 17 Sustainability Goals of Agenda 21. Now we skip forward to 1955. On the 14th of December 1955, as the 10th General Assembly drew to a close, Ireland took its place as the 63rd member of the United Nations. Membership of the United Nations has been central to Ireland's foreign policy since we became a member in 1955. Next on, we go to 1968. The cry of overpopulation was again taken up by Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University, and in 1968 he claimed that reckless human reproduction had overwhelmed the earth. Massive famines would result, which would destroy, the best case scenario, 1/5 of humanity by the end of the 70s, and the planet would soon follow. This fair produced large donations for the newly created UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, which thrives on an imagined crisis that has been both imminent and rescheduled again and again for the past 2 centuries. The truth of the matter is that every family on this planet could have a house with a yard and all live together on a landmass the size of Texas, which is really just a small corner of the planet. The population of Earth will always peak, and then naturally it starts to go back down. But for years there's been a push to shove birth control and abortion down the throats of women in developing countries who don't want either. By the way, we don't get to pick who is desirable or useful enough to reproduce, and who should be restricted in the name of global common good. That's called eugenics, and it can lead down a slippery slope to things like ethnic cleansing and genocide. Now we skip forward to 1972. In a document called The First Global Revolution, authored by Alexander King and Bertrand Schneider, on pages 104 and 105, it stated, in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All the dangers, of course, will be caused by human intervention that will require a global response. That's the origin of global warming and climate change, ladies and gentlemen. In the 1972 Limits to Growth book, there were many different scenarios. All of them show that growth stops sometime in the year 2020. 2020 was this tipping point in which the Club of Rome and the computer created by IBM at MIT in the 70s, they had some AI software that declared some sort of impending doom over rising population unless some sort of new global governance response took place. Almost an idea that suggested we needed a reset by 2020, roughly about 50 years prior to Klaus Schwab's Great Reset, which happened in the year 2020.
It's not some science fantasy effect from 2001. This electronic display emanating from Australia's largest computer is a picture of the condition, past, present and future of planet Earth. The program was originally devised by a scientist working from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Jay Forrester. It was developed under the auspices of the Club of Rome by an MIT research team to present a complex model of the world and what we humans are doing to it. The program, called World One, doesn't pretend to be a precise forecast. What it does for the first time in man's history on the planet is to look at the world as one system. It shows that Earth cannot sustain present population and industrial growth for much more than a few decades. It shows that simply cleaning up our car exhausts and making some small effort to limit our families simply isn't enough. It's like an electronic guided tour of our global behavior since 1900 and where that behavior will lead us. Well, this is the printed version of what we've just seen on the television screen. What looks at first to be just a maze of computer characteristics is really a system of very simple graphs which project what's going to happen to the planet over the next 150 years if we don't do something drastic to stop it. Down the left-hand side of the graph is the date, 1900, 1940, 1980, 2020, right down to 2060. Now, each of these lines of letters represents a curve showing some aspect of the condition of the planet. The further out this way they go, the greater that figure is. The further this way, the less. For example, P represents population. So here it is at 1900, and then it comes up to 1940, it starts to take off. Here we are at 1980, up to the turn of the century, and then it starts to peter off. Let's now have a look at this next curve, the Q curve, which is the quality of life. And this is represented by, for example, the amount of space people have, the amount of money they have to spend, the amount of food they have to eat. Now, it increases rapidly up to 1940, but from 1940 on, the quality of life diminishes. And here we are about the turn of the century, and we come up to the year 2020, and it's really come right back. More people, of course, means that you start to chew up your supply of natural resources. And this is this curve here, the N curve, that shows that slowly but steadily the pool of natural wealth in the world, natural resources, minerals, oil and so on, is slowly but steadily diminishing. So this is the situation. As population increases, the quality of life decreases and the supply of natural resources decreases. But have a look at this curve here. This is called the Z curve, and it represents pollution. Now, predictably enough, as the population increases up to 1980, pollution increases. There's more rubbish. But from 1980 to the year 2020, pollution really takes off. This is assuming, of course, that we don't do anything about it. So the year 2020, the condition of the planet starts to become highly critical. And if we don't do anything about it, this is what's going to happen. The quality of life is going to go right back to practically zero. Pollution is going to become so serious, right out here, that it will start to kill people. So the population will diminish. Right back here, less than it was in the year 1900. And at this stage, around about the year 2040, 2050, civilized life as we know it on this planet will cease to exist. Well, hopefully, of course, it won't be allowed to happen. But it's taken this kind of shock treatment to nudge governments into doing something.
Financed by Volkswagen and sponsored by the Club of Rome, we got the book Limits to Growth. The Club of Rome is described as a crisis think tank which specialises in crisis creation. The main purpose of this think tank was to formulate a crisis that would unite the world and condition us to the idea of globalism. Unite the world with a common enemy and a common threat to all mankind, such as COVID-19 or climate change.
In one way or another, we are so far, globally, we are so far above the population and the consumption levels which can be supported by this planet that I know in one way or another it's going to come back down. So I don't hope to avoid that. I hope that it can occur in a civil way, and I mean civil in a special way, peaceful. Peace doesn't mean that everybody's happy, but it means that conflict isn't solved through violence, through force, but rather in other ways. And so that's what I hope for. That we can, I mean, the planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people. And conversely, you can have more people. I mean, we could even have 8 or 9 billion probably if we have a very strong dictatorship, which is smart. Unfortunately, you never have smart dictatorships. They're always stupid. So, but if you had a smart dictatorship and a low standard of living, you can have it. But we want to have freedom and we want to have a high sentence, so we're going to have 1 billion people. And we're now at 7, so we have to get back down. I hope that this can be slow, relatively slow, and that it can be done in a way which is relatively equal, so that people share the experience and you don't have a few rich, trying to force everybody else to deal with it. So those are my hopes. I mean, these are pretty pessimistic hopes, but that's what lies ahead.
Now we go to 1992, Agenda 21. This is a plan that was agreed to by 179 nations. It's called the Agenda for the 21st Century. It's a totalitarian state that's being developed right now all over the world. It is the inventory and control plan. Inventory and control of all land, all water, all minerals, all plants, all animals, all construction, all means of production, all food, all energy, all information, and all human beings in the world. And this plan was signed up by 179 nations in 1992. Ireland's then Taoiseach at the time was Fianna Fáil Albert Reynolds. He signed Ireland into agreeing the United Nations Agenda 21. Ireland thus solidified its position of being an obedient United Nations member state and pledged itself to be fully on board with its internationalist agenda. By 2000, countries including Ireland were being governed by directions of the United Nations. G7, G20, World Economic Forum and World Health Organization, to name some. Every organization named as a foreign-based NGO, which is non-governmental organization, and every member of these organizations are unelected. Parliamentary procedures for law changes weren't followed since then. United Nations, shortly after 1992, issued plans to push the Green Agenda into all community groups around Ireland and around the world using the NGO system. Although they say Agenda 21 was a non-binding agreement, every town across Ireland and across the world adopted the agenda for the 21st century. Now we go into 2019. More than 11,000 scientists signed a petition calling for population control as a means of combating climate change. In an article published in the journal Bioscience in 2019, the scientists wrote that planet Earth is, quote, facing a climate emergency. They argue that population control was a necessary response to this emergency, writing, quote, the world population must be stabilized and ideally gradually reduced. This ideology is dangerous because it suggests that reducing the human population is the best solution to our problems.
We declare with more than 11,000 scientist signatories from around the world, clearly and unequivocally, that our planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. Climate change is more severe than predicted, and it's accelerating faster than scientists were expecting.
We collected 2 sets of data over the last 40 years, things like population growth, fertility rate, meat consumption, and then in parallel we also looked at atmospheric CO2, nitrous oxide, methane, ice melting.
The data is looking much worse than expected. So what we have in this paper is a call to action. Reducing carbon dioxide emissions dramatically, stopping deforestation and planting a lot of trees, reducing meat. And finally, we talk about curbing the population explosion, for example, educating girls and young women about family planning options.
President Trump's response has been really unfortunate in terms of the Paris Agreement. And one of the things we tried to highlight in our paper is that there's things individuals can do and things that are more appropriately done at the level of policy.
The message I would send to President Trump is that it's very important for the United States to lead the world in fighting climate change. Greta is fantastic. She's inspiring many people around the world, and actually she inspires me, and that helped inspire this current project. We are at a social tipping point where humanity is talking enough about climate change and starting to take action that we might actually see some really positive things happening here as we move forward.
Finally, 2020 arrives, and guess what comes along with it? The Club of Rome's and the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, which was predetermined almost 50 years prior to the event. And the Club of Rome think tank set out the goals to lower population and change the way we are governed to a more green, a more sustainable communist dictatorship. Our public officials, the Taoiseach and representatives of Ireland were partnered with private corporations back in 1992 when they signed documentations that would inevitably take away every bit of our freedoms to the United Nations without the consent of the people they were meant to represent. They signed an agenda that helped implement a global or international agenda instead of representing a local one. The International Council and local and environmental issues became the main source of consultation to push and fund the global agenda into our NGO system and community groups. I remind you that the World Economic Forum and the United Nations signed a strategic partnership framework in 2019 to jointly accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
This afternoon, the Secretary-General and Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, will witness the signing of a Memorandum of Understanding on a strategic partnership between the UN and the World Economic Forum, which outlines areas of cooperation to deepen engagement between the two institutions and to jointly accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda.
This is the same World Economic Forum whose chairman, Klaus Schwab, famously declared, "You will own nothing and you will be happy." This is the same Klaus Schwab who, referring to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, boasted, "We have penetrated more than half of his cabinet."
They all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, is that we penetrate the cabinets. So half of this cabinet, or even more, half of this cabinet are for our actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
And calls Leo Varadkar one of his young global leaders.
And finally, the Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of Ireland, Leo Varadkar, particularly welcome because you are also one of our young global leaders. So,
is he still young?
Yeah, he is still young. We all are young here.
Why should Irish brothers and sisters bow down to the intrusive dictates of a non-elected foreign entity? The fact is, we should not, and we will not. Whether it's the threat of COVID-19 or threats of global hacking, threats of the bad far-right bogeyman or climate change, they want a system built that can control its sheep. That system or prison is being built this very second under the guise of 15-minute smart cities. You may ask, what does any of this have to do with 15 smart cities? Well, absolutely everything. Smart. S is for surveillance. M is for monitoring. A is for analysis. R is for reporting. And T is for technology. Technology news editor Patrick Wood, 50 years of experience and expertise on technocracy, wrote, "The 15-minute cities is a cover for data collection for the technocrats who design and operate them. You see, data is essentially the new currency for the so-called internationalist elites. Cities designed for maximum efficiency always revealed technocrat thinking, and efficiency itself is the goal. Maximum surveillance allows for maximum control to achieve even more efficiency. At its very root, this thinking is anti-humane. But so too is Agenda 21. The experts and scientists talk about net zero carbon to save the planet. Firstly, I'd love these experts to show anyone that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. But secondly, what on earth is net zero? If we had net zero, in other words, if we didn't release carbon dioxide, then we wouldn't eat. Because when you eat, you convert carbon compound, which goes into your body, and the rest you get rid of. We breathe in 0.04% carbon dioxide, we breathe out 4%. That's us getting rid of carbon dioxide. You see, if we had to reach net zero, we'd all have to drop dead. The 15-minute smart city narrative seeks to fool you into the guise of saving the planet, keeping you safe and delivering convenience. Tyrannical governments love to trick its people into trading their freedoms for the false pretense of security and convenience. But in reality, these cities or prisons actually act as a gateway to digital IDs and CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. CBDCs allow bankers and our governments to freeze your bank account because you happen to peacefully or lawfully protest and express your disagreement with government policies. Does anyone remember the Canadian truckers when the Government of Canada invoked the Emergency Act and froze the private bank accounts of law-abiding citizens? 15-minute cities are wolves in sheep's clothing. Don't believe the countless stories spewing forth from the 24/7 propaganda from the elitist captured mainstream media, all claiming to have your best interest at heart. We have been burnt too many times by the same politicians and journalists, yet people blindly still place their never-ending trust within them. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Yet these parasites continue to lie and deceive to the same people for years, as the same people continue to fall for their lies over and over. How much longer will it take to realise your government are not your friends? They work against you, and the journalists are complicit in helping their buddies with 24/7 propaganda. 24/7 surveillance for the Internet of Things inside your home. 5G and LED streetlights outside monitoring and tracking and recording everything. Implementation of exclusion zones and geofencing to restrict movement and travel. If you don't believe me this could happen in Ireland, or that people wouldn't allow it, just think back to COVID lockdowns. Property and car ownership to be outlawed, pushed with a false pretense again for electric cars to replace petrol or diesel cars.
I want to go all electric by 2035. Is it practical to do it now?
Well, we can make this whole discussion easy with the two-letter word, no. There's no such thing, of course, as a zero-emissions vehicle. The real question is, where are the emissions associated with the electric car? Because what you do with an electric vehicle is you don't eliminate emissions, you export them somewhere else. You have to dig up about 500,000 pounds of materials to make a single 1,000-pound battery. It takes 100 to 300 barrels of oil to manufacture a battery that can hold 1 barrel of oil equivalent of energy. Just manufacturing the battery can have a carbon debt ranging from 10 tons to 40 tons of CO2. And the plans that are in place to increase the use of batteries will require an increase in production of minerals like lithium, cobalt, zinc. Demand for those minerals will increase between 400% and 4,000%. There isn't enough mining in the world to make enough batteries for that many people for their car.
Evictions from farms in rural areas to gather people into the smart city prisons. Digital passports being created by the United Nations World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization are in the final stages of planning and implementation, similar to the QR vaccine certification that we saw in 2021. These passports, called ID 2020, will be tied up to social credit scores, which determines your compliance to government directives. It will control all access and all aspects of life. Digital currency is being implemented to end cash, and more so, monitor all your spending. Your digital currency will be turned off or on depending on your compliance score. Universal basic income is a state-controlled allowance forcing compliance by restricting access to food, money, services and education. All of the above will enable climate lockdowns to be implemented easily and indefinitely without much fight back. The real agenda of 15-minute smart cities is to monitor and control everyone and everything. The real agenda of Agenda 21 is to take all means of production and assets, such as property, away from everyone, so you are now fully reliant on government for everything. The reliance means compliance. I'm asking all people to open dialogue and ask a list of questions to your local representatives, such as, can council explicitly guarantee that the citizens will remain free to travel, as is their right under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Can council guarantee not to restrict access to essential services, medical care, bank accounts, government pensions, utilities, etc.? We need to turn back the page to a simpler time when open, transparent government served its citizens and worked in their best interests and not the interests of internationalists.
Greta Thunberg, one of the other horsemen of the environmental apocalypse.
Yeah, well, it's funny that people didn't notice right away that she is a young girl with pigtails, because that's what Stalin and Mao and Hitler all used young girls with pigtails in their photographs. It's all been well documented. I don't know what the pigtails has to do with it, but dictators seems almost always use children as a front to make it look as though they're nice. There's all kinds of photographs of her on trains with the head of Greenpeace and, of course, Al Gore, and the list is endless. And her speeches are written for her, obviously, and she doesn't know anything much about climate change or science. So what is she then? She's simply a tool. She is not a wise person telling us what we should be doing. She is being used by Hollywood actors and phony politicians like Al Gore, none of whom actually have any science.
Hello, I'm Severin Suzuki, speaking for ECHO, the Environmental Children's Organization. We're a group of 12 and 13-year-olds trying to make a difference. Vanessa Setti, Morgan Geisler, Michelle Quigg, and me. We've raised all the money to come here ourselves, to come 5,000 miles to tell you adults you must change your ways. Coming up here today, I have no hidden agenda. I am fighting for my future. Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market. I am here to speak for all generations to come. I am here to speak on behalf of the starving children around the world whose cries go unheard. I am here to speak for the countless animals dying across this planet because they have nowhere left to go. I am afraid to go out in the sun now because of the holes in our ozone. I am afraid to breathe the air because I don't know what chemicals are in it. I used to go fishing in Vancouver, my home, with my dad, until just a few years ago we found the fish full of cancers. And now we hear of animals and plants going extinct, every day vanishing forever. In my life, I have dreamt of seeing the great herds of wild animals, jungles and rainforests full of birds and butterflies. But now I wonder if they will even exist for my children to see. Did you have to worry of these things when you were my age? All this is happening before our eyes, and yet we act as if we have all the time we want and all the solutions. I'm only a child, and I don't have all the solutions. But I want you to realize, neither do you. You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forests that once grew where there is now a desert. If you don't know how to fix it, please stop breaking it.
Do you guys ever think about dying?
Is there a specific policy goal? If he rang you up and said, Greta, what should I do? What I can wave a presidential magic wand executive order. What should I do that I'm not? What would you say to him?
Well, nothing, because that's not democratic. An elected leader cannot do anything without support from voters, and I would not want anyone to do anything that would not have the support, because that would be undemocratic, and democracy is the most precious thing that we have, and we must not risk that. So I would just tell him to tell the situation as it is. Since the climate crisis doesn't exist, how can we expect people to want climate action?
That's a fair point.
Plan on doing great things in life. If a man decides that I'm an object and does unspeakable and tragic things to me, am I a child supposed to carry and birth another child? Some here say they are pro-life. What about my life? And does my life not matter to you?
Even though humanity is failing on its climate policy objectives,
This means that extreme weather will still impact the normal global life, and some evil state will also weaponize its outcomes. And when people in the streets of New York and other cities of the world went out on climate protest, we all have seen them. And when people in Morocco and Libya and other countries die as a result of natural disasters, and when islands and countries disappear underwater, and when tornadoes and deserts are spreading into new territories, and when all of this is happening, one unnatural disaster in Moscow decided to launch a big war.
I've worked on climate change for 25 years.
I worked on climate change since '73.
So you
just to
worked on
tell
it
you,
longer than
because I was the person who gave the Club of Rome the first big platform. I share with you the concern, and I think we can solve those issues only if we repair our global architecture and our global system.
Depopulation was always a vital aspect of Agenda 21.
When you start to see people like Bill Gates gobble up farmland, and you read what his foundation says about farming, when they say that we're going to have a particular type of agriculture, they want large blocks run by the government or by private consortia where they say we're not going to have animal-based proteins, we're not going to have stockyards, we're not going to have turkey farms, we're not going to have chicken. The academic mind always has the answers, but never in the real world. And they do a lot of damage.
Everywhere you look, small and medium-sized farms being gobbled up by these corporate mega farms because they can't keep up anymore. They can't comply with these endless streams of regulations that are coming down. We're seeing that in China now, where these giant mechanized corporate big government controlled mega farms are displacing all these little small family farms that families have been farming for hundreds of years, in some cases longer. They're moving them all off their little plots of land and moving them into these big, horrific mega cities that they have built. And we're going to see that all over the world with the decimation of small farms. So if they're not bankrupted by economic forces, the government itself will shut them down.
Everything is falling apart. There is a shortage of food. Many people do not have enough money to eat every day.
Everybody's out here today because they understand that when our government actually expropriates our farmers, you know, we're all next.
Not just Holland is now facing these types of regulations, but you can see the attack on farmers all over the world. It's an agenda that is carried out on a global level, that is being pushed through government officials in respective countries.
This is precisely how the globalists have managed to take over national parliaments and national governments.
20 countries equal 80% of all the emissions. You solve the problem to start with by making sure all of those 20 countries are doing what they need to do. We have to pull them to the table and leverage further. So how do we get there? Well, the lesson I've learned in the last year is money, 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 money.
They're following a script where they are thinking already from the perspective of a global, bureaucratic, quasi-totalitarian system of governing, system of rule. This is an agenda, and all these countries are implementing the same policies. So they've targeted the farmers because that's the agenda.
Right now, things have tripled as far as costs for my own farming operation and for many farmers across the country. And I think you're going to see across the board higher food prices.
Food prices are already up dramatically this year, last year a little bit too, and we might see more empty shelves in America. Even the president is promising food shortages in his conversations, so there's no need for this to be happening. You know, the people are the ones that are going to be hurt. You know, not just farmers, you know, trying to make a living. It's going to be the food supply of this country, which is a staple of our security of our nation, being able to grow the grain and the crops that we do, that not only supplies us, but our allies and other trading partners around the world.
We have 8 billion people on the planet now, and that's sustainable if they allow agriculture to continue to be mechanized and genetically altered. And I don't think they understand that if they tamper with that, you're going to have people go hungry.
We are headed into, I think, a time of very significant food shortages. Can we expect to see massive increases in food prices next year? Oh, no question about it. So I think the end goal of the war on farmers that we're seeing, which is guided at every step by the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, is going to be a total consolidation of agriculture, a total consolidation of the food supply, and as every communist tyrant of the last 100 years has understood, if you
back in time now, 650,000 years, here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
Al Gore says the relationship between temperature and CO2 is complicated, but he doesn't say what those complications are. In fact, there was something very important in the ice core data that he failed to mention. Professor Ian Clark is a leading Arctic paleoclimatologist who looks back into the Earth's temperature record tens of millions of years.
When we look at climate on long scales, we're looking for geological material that actually records climate. If we're to take an ice sample, for example, we use isotopes to reconstruct temperature, but the atmosphere that's imprisoned in that ice, we liberate, and then we look at the CO2 content.
Professor Clark and others have indeed discovered, as Al Gore says, a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But what Al Gore doesn't say is that the link is the wrong way round.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then, after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans.
Okay, dump the ice cubes in here.
Okay. Whoops.
Okay, now I would like you to fill that glass with ice cubes.
Okay.
Certainly full, right?
Yeah.
In fact, sticking over the top. Okay, next, I would like you to take these two glasses over to the sink and fill them both almost full of water. Then bring it back, okay? Okay. Now you notice I'm wiping off the table so there's not a drop of water on it.
Okay.
And I will wipe off this plate so there's not a drop of water on it.
Why?
Well, you'll find out in just a moment, because I would like you now to use this long medicine dropper and take water from there and fill it, this glass, so that it's right to the very brim with water.
Okay.
Don't let it overflow, but get it right to the very top. Aha! That's it. Okay. Move this out of the way. Wipe everything up so there's no water anyplace. Now my question is, as the ice melts, will the water overflow over the top of the glass?
I think so.
Why?
Well, because like you have the water, and the water is full to the top, and then you have the ice also, and like I think while the ice melts, it'll just overflow.
Okay, that's one theory, and that's definitely a theory, right?
Yeah.
You know what a theory is. Well, there's another theory, which I would like to advance and see how you like that. As you know, ice expands when it freezes as compared to water. That's why ice floats, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So therefore, as the ice condenses, in other words, goes back into water, it should take up less space, therefore the water level will drop.
Okay, yeah, I see.
That's theory 2.
Yep.
Now there's a third theory. Obviously, the volume of the water is taking into consideration the ice that we've got in there. So as it melts, it's not going to change at all, because the volume has already got that ice floating in it.
Okay, I see.
That's the third theory. Which one are you going to take?
Mine. My theory.
The first one?
Yep.
That it's going to overflow.
Yeah.
Okay, now that's why I wanted to wipe up everything so there's no water around any place.
I
We're going to let it sit there very carefully and melt. It'll take about 2 hours. Can we be back in 2 hours?
Sure.
And I promise I won't touch it.
Okay.
Okay?
Hi.
Hi, Karen. Ah, you're right on time. 2 hours. You're very punctual. Are you usually?
Most of the time.
Okay. There's the glass that had the ice in it. Don't touch the counter now.
It didn't melt.
And your theory was that it was going to melt and flow over the top, right?
Yeah.
And why was that?
Well, the ice, like it was floating above the top of the glass, so I thought it would melt.
Okay. That was
Go
one
over.
theory. That was no good. Now, the second theory was that the ice expanded as it would change from water to ice, therefore took up less space, so that as it melted, it would take up less space, so the water level ought to drop.
Yeah.
Didn't, did it?
No.
So the third theory, you remember now I told you that as you added water to the ice and you got it all to float, the level of the water took into effect the mass of the ice.
Yeah.
And therefore, as it melted, that water level is going to stay exactly the same. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
The overwhelming consensus on the climate change crisis is manufactured. Prominent scientist Professor Dr. Judith Curry, currently serving as president at the Climate Forecast Applications Network. Climate Forecast Applications Network has responded to growing needs for more realistic scenarios for regional climate change on decadal timescales than can be provided by global climate models. Is active in advancing novel ideas and approaches in weather and climate services. They are recognized as innovators in pushing the boundaries of effective forecasting and advancing the understanding of weather and climate prediction and predictability. They have built a team with rich expertise in the core fields of meteorology, climatology, mathematical and computer sciences, and decision support. Dr. Judith Curry, former climate alarmist.
I was adopted by the environmental advocacy groups and the alarmists, and I was treated like a rock star.
What does that mean, treated like a rock star?
Oh my God, I was flown all over the place to meet with politicians and to give these talks and lots of media attention.
Then the ClimateGate scandal taught Curry that many researchers aren't so open-minded. Leaked emails showed university climate scientists conspiring to hide data.
It showed a lot of really ugly things, avoiding Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to get journal editors fired from their job.
One email read, "If you think this Yale professor is in the skeptics camp, get him ousted."
Now functioning as a whistleblower, reveals the truth about the climate change industry. It manufactured the global warming consensus.
A manufactured consensus.
Researcher Judith Curry says climate scientists have an incentive to exaggerate risk.
Why? What's in it for them?
Fame and fortune.
She now blows the whistle and unveils the truth.
Climate change fanatics had corrupted the science because there's a climate change industry set up to reward alarmism.
The origins go back to the 1980s. The UN Environmental Program.
Some UN officials had a specific agenda.
Anti-capitalism, they hated the oil companies, and they seized on the climate change issue as one to move their policies along.
The UN created what's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
The IPCC wasn't supposed to focus on any benefits of warming. The IPCC's mandate was to look for dangerous human-caused climate change.
Obviously, if you're only looking for risk, that's what you'll find.
Then the national funding agencies directed all the funding in the field.
If you say we're all going to die and we got to spend a ton of money on this, you get funding. If you say we don't know, you don't get funding?
No, it's more subtle than that. The announcements of opportunity for funding are really tied to assuming that there are dangerous impacts.
So the researchers aren't stupid. They know what they need to say to get funding.
Exactly.
This is how manufactured consensus happens. Then, even if a skeptic does get funding, it's harder to publish because journal editors are alarmist.
If you wanted to advance in your career, like be at a prestigious university, get a big salary, have big laboratory space, get lots of grant funding, be director of an institute, well, there was clearly one path to go.
So alarmist researchers control the discussion. They publish lots of scary papers, and alarmist media jump on those.
Why don't other scientists who recognize the nonsense push back?
If they work at a university, it's going to be very uncomfortable for them.
Universities have become idiots and they punish people who tell the truth?
I mean, I felt the hostility.
Curry was a department chair at Georgia Tech until she concluded that fossil fuels aren't so terrible.
They want fossil fuels to go away.
When they made life uncomfortable for her, she looked for other university jobs, but was told,
nobody will hire you, because if you Google Judith Curry, everything that shows up with Judith Curry denier, Judith Curry serial climate disinformer. At that point, I started making my plans to transition 100% to the private sector.
She started this weather forecasting company. Now climate alarmists smear her as a climate denier doing it for the money. But she made more money at Georgia Tech.
If I was doing this for the money, I would have stayed at Georgia Tech and sucked up my big salary. But that's not who I am. My personal and professional integrity would not allow me to play that game.
Fast. What % of our atmosphere is CO2? Take your best guess. You don't have to be accurate. All down the line.
Repeat that question.
What % of our atmosphere is CO2, carbon dioxide? Wild guess, it's okay.
About 5%.
5?
I'll just follow you then.
We'll go 7. I'll see their 5 and suggest that we know that transportation causes 49% of CO2, so that's why we're all working on energy transition.
All right. So what number do you think it is?
5.
5? How about you? I didn't hear you, Mr. Dreher.
7.
7. Did you have one, Mr. Boyd?
So we got a 5, 7.
This Price is Right.
8. I'm going to hit the high end.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, and I don't mean to I put you on ice. I ask a lot of people that because all we hear is climate change, CO2, CO2. The answer is 0.04%. Not 1%, not a half of a percent. It's 0.04%. It's gone up from 0.03 over the last couple decades. This is what we're being all contorted into doing, is this tiny change in CO2. If we get below 0.02, plant life starts dying out.
We have some sad news to report here. A giant in the weather world and the first weatherman at Good Morning America has died. Meteorologist John Coleman passed away at the age of 83. He founded the Weather Channel, was also a longtime meteorologist here at KUSI.
Thinks climate change is a hoax. His name is John Coleman. Before launching the Weather Channel in the early 1980s, he was the original weatherman on Good Morning America. And after launching the channel, he was also a local weatherman in New York, Chicago, and San Diego.
I resent you calling me a denier. That is a word meant to put me down. I'm a skeptic about climate change, and I want to make it darn clear Mr. Kenney's not a scientist. I am. He's the CEO of the Weather Channel now. I was the founder of the Weather Channel, not the co-founder.
And I'm glad you did, because I am addicted to the Weather Channel. I watch a lot of cable news.
Now, hold on just a minute. I'm not done. And CNN has taken a very strong position on global warming that it is a consensus. Well, there is no consensus in science. Science isn't a vote. Science is about facts. And if you get down to the hard, cold facts, there's no question about it. climate change is not happening. There is no significant man-made global warming now. There hasn't been any in the past, and there's no reason to expect any in the future. There's a whole lot of baloney, and yes, it has become a big political point of the Democratic Party and part of their platform, and I regret it's become political instead of scientific, but the science is on my side.
You told the Associated Press that the American government has created weather tampering techniques so that the New World Order will be able to starve millions of Americans and to control the rest. Would you explain what you were trying to say?
Well, what I was trying to say is exactly what I said. There is weather control techniques. We have a complete package on that, which I did not bring, but I certainly will see to it that it is brought in for the record. Number one, the entire patents on the equipment. Number two, Senator Claiborne Pell's complete statement and story of his own that not only does it exist, but that we even utilize it as far back as the Vietnam War. You might want to touch base with Senator Pell.
I just want to repeat before I turn to...
So yes, but we do have all that information.
You're saying the government has created weather tampering techniques so that the, quote, New World Order will be able to starve millions of Americans...
Worldwide.
Millions of Americans, and to control the rest.
Yes, sir, and that's my belief. As bizarre as that sounds, if somebody had told me that that equipment even existed 10 years ago, I would have thought they were nuts, sir. And at this point in time, we have all the documents to prove it. And if you think that 85 tornadoes takes place in the middle of our growing area by simultaneous accident, I'm sorry. With the equipment that's already set up internationally, and as bizarre as that is, it is proven and documented. We will supply you with those documents. As bizarre as that is, I would say that weather wars, and this is quoting actually Senator Claiborne Pell himself, that they are the greatest weapon ever created.
Hello, everybody. There is no global warming.
What I do wonder is when you see the government, when you see NASA, when you see other institutions say that 97% of climate scientists agree, do you think they're making it up? What I don't understand is how you square that.
Well, that's a manipulated figure, and let me explain it to you. The government puts out about $2.5 billion directly for climate research every year. It only gives that money to scientists who will produce scientific results that support the global warming hypothesis of the Democrat Party position. So they don't have any choice. If you're going to get the money, you got to support their position. Therefore, 97% of the scientific reports published support global warming. Why? Because those are the ones the government pays for, and that's where the money is. It's real simple, but that doesn't mean it's right. That doesn't make it true. That only makes it bought and paid for. The money goes in circles. There are 31,000 scientists who have signed a petition that says it is not valid, that my position is correct. And we'll keep battling, and we will prevail in time, but I don't know if we'll do it in my lifetime.
And now we're learning that scientists and researchers are looking at how to change the weather on purpose. That's right. Lasers now could one day manipulate rain and lightning. CBS This Morning contributor Michio Kaku is a physics professor at City College of New York. Professor, nice to see you.
We physicists are firing trillion-watt lasers into the sky to actually precipitate rain clouds and actually bring down lightning bolts. This is potentially a game changer.
But this is experimental.
It's experimental. However, in the laboratory so far it works. When you have water vapor and you have dust particles or ice crystals, you can precipitate rain. It condenses around the seeds. These seeds can also be created by laser beams. By firing trillion-watt lasers, you rip apart the electrons, creating what are called ions, and these ions act like seeds, like dust particles, bringing down rain and even lightning.
China had used this during the Olympics, that the USSR had used this after Chernobyl to create rain clouds. I mean, did those really work then? We have some of these capabilities now?
Even in the 60s, the CIA used this to bring down monsoons during the Vietnam War, to wash out the Viet Cong. Now, we realize that for decades now, these governments have been alleged to have experimented with weather control. We're actually using trillion-watt lasers now. Sure enough, they precipitate rain out of water vapor. Sure enough, you can actually bring down electricity down the beam.
In the 20th century, clouds were seeded by numerous countries around the globe with various chemicals to produce rain. China was just doing this over the summer in Beijing to make sure that there weren't any rain, that there wasn't any rain during the Olympics. But all this has changed dramatically with the U.S. military's secretive research and plans to control the planet's natural weather. This has not been given very much press, and we have to remember that we have a corporate-owned press where 85% of radio, television, and print media is owned by 5 corporations. So they're not going to talk about things that are of really serious consequence. The Air Force is on record as saying, quote, they want to control the weather by 2025, and we are not talking about just seeding the clouds for rain. Weather modification means, quote, any activity performed with the intention of producing artificial changes in the composition, behavior, or dynamics of the atmosphere, unquote. And as of April this year, there are more than 150 different weather modification programs around the world. Since about 2000, the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy have been spraying the entire United States sky with the toxic brew of chemicals and other biologic agents. Just want to show you something. We have 2 different kinds of trails in the sky right now. One are called contrails. How many of you know what contrails are? Contrails are what have been around from the ends of planes since World War II. These are very, very short exhaust trails that usually evaporate within a few minutes. You just look up at the sky and you'll just see a jet, sometimes with 4 trails, but it evaporates pretty quickly. How many of you know what chemtrails are? Nobody. The military and some commercial planes are spraying us with what are called chemtrails.
They have completely put out the sun, guys. Unbelievable what they're doing today. Unbelievable. Either you're a paid troll or you're completely ignorant of the situation, and being ignorant is extremely dangerous. They have put out the sun. It was blue skies this morning. Blue skies no longer. Stand above.
I want you to look at and oftentimes before there's a weather front, there are heavy assaults from these planes just before a weather front is changed and comes in. Military and some commercial jets have been fitted with huge barrels of at least 49 different kinds of documented chemical poisons. Among other documented ingredients in this toxic man-made clouds are pathogenic molds, fungi, weaponized viruses made in some places like the secret site at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is supposed to be a cancer site, but there are a number of scholars and professors tracking this that have big questions about this. Barium and nanoaluminum particles. What do these do to the human body? Barium is an alkaline earth mineral. It was discovered in 1774. At low doses, it can act as a muscle stimulant. At high doses, it detrimentally affects the heart and the nervous system. Barium is toxic to all mammals, and that means not just humans. Aluminum, which is the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, is known to diminish kidney function and destroy brain cells and cognitive function. Just think about it. Just between the aluminum and the mercury that we're breathing all the time, we've got already a serious issue about brain function and cognitive function. There is also documented evidence that the aluminum in chemtrails is released as nanoparticles, and that when they reach the Earth, environment for wildlife in lakes and streams. It's causing serious problems with wildlife there. Researchers are also finding that nanoparticles interfere with the growth of plants. Nanotechnology is totally unregulated. Just this past month, a new research report came out showing and documenting for the first time that these nanoparticles actually go through the skin. Well, if you breathe them, whether they go through the skin or whether you're inhaling them, it's still a problem, a serious problem.
According to the World Meteorological Organization, 52 countries have a weather modification program.
Increase in snowfall is, a very significant value add to organizations like hydropower companies.
To do that, pilots target clouds full of moisture and eject small amounts of an inert chemical. And what's inside of these guys?
It's a silver iodide mixture. The idea is that we'll be above some liquid water, and as it's falling through, it'll turn into snow, so it can fall out of the cloud.
Since the 1946 experiments of Dr. Vincent Schaefer, we have known that some clouds can be modified through seeding to yield additional precipitation.
It's not as if you guys are creating clouds out of nowhere. You actually target storm systems.
If there's no clouds in the sky that have any moisture in them, then we can't do anything.
Weather Modification International provided the planes. A team of scientists set out into the Idaho mountains with Doppler radars and state-of-the-art weather stations to record what happens on the ground when planes above are cloud seeding. What did you guys find?
The aircraft flies through that, and you can see the ice crystals grow right on the radar, and you can see the snow showers form, and as they pass over the mountain, you can see the snow very visually and conclusively is produced from the cloud seeding aircraft that just flew through that particular cloud and system.
Radar images show how ice crystals formed in the clouds in the exact pattern that Weather Modification's pilots were flying. The long-awaited scientific proof that cloud seeding was working had finally arrived.
Now, the most amazing thing is that cloud up there, which was generated by the engine.
First MasterCard in the world that is going to show a carbon allowance for every single purchase you buy. And to make sure that everything has a so-called carbon credit, food, when you buy food now, if it's vegan, it's going to show you this nice low score of only 1 kilogram, 1.3 kilograms of CO2 per serving. Now, meat will be off the chart, so that's going to be a no-no. This is how they're going to control where you go,
how you're going to get there, what you can buy, what you can eat, who you can see, and now imagine that in a world without cash.
Into the C40 websites. The C40 is the consortium of municipalities that have signed on to the 15-minute city plan, and I read in their own documentation, this is relevant to the tri-state city idea, that their goals are to reduce caloric consumption to 2,500 calories a day by force, essentially, within the next 15 years, to ensure that the peasant class, which is everybody but the elitists, can't fly more than one time every 3 years, to not merely shift private car ownership from fossil fuel to electric, which is fundamentally impossible because the grid can't handle it, but to eliminate 90% of private car ownership so that people are forced to take unbelievably expensive in terms of time utilization and non-existent public transportation systems, and to limit the amount of travel that people can do outside of their neighborhoods. And, and then I watch the legacy media claim that pointing that out is something akin to a right-wing conspiracy, which it most certainly isn't, because you can just find the bloody documentation online. And then I look at places like China, which have taken this to an extreme. 600 million closed-circuit TV cameras in China. 1 for every 1.5 persons watching the Chinese all the time, able to monitor them 100% by face, and also to identify them by gait, and to limit their ability to do absolutely anything, to buy, to sell, to travel, to move, to leave their neighborhood, with this top-down surveillance system that perversely and consciously some of the Chinese engineers have actually named Skynet, and in a conscious attempt to produce a positive version of, the absolutely catastrophic, apocalyptic artificial intelligence that was in the bloody Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. And you can't even talk about this stuff without sounding like a raving conspiratorialist, but there it is. Now, tell me more about the tri-state city. So what have you seen? Because I don't know anything about it, neither does anybody else watching, I presume, except for, those who've gone down the rabbit hole with you.
I was reading a book about cholera a couple of years ago. I think it was called Ghost Map. And interestingly, towards the end of the book, the author, in an otherwise excellent book, started talking about these smart cities where, basically everything, we don't have to worry about any disease anymore, that sort of thing. Last time I was in China, I got kicked out of Hong Kong in 2020. I was a bad boy. I was watching the protests, and they finally kicked me out after 7 months. But that was Hong Kong. But last time I was in mainland China, I was actually researching information war. I was in places like Nanjing and Shanghai and that sort of thing. But I was in southern China, where the Uyghurs are, for part of that trip. And I was talking with restaurant owners and farmers and that sort of thing. And various restaurant owners told me that when a Uyghur comes in, they are mandated by law to call the police immediately. The police immediately come to check. So the smart city goes beyond mere optics. They're installing those cameras all over Hong Kong. They were doing that when I left. That's in Hong Kong. But over in mainland China, it's not just the cameras everywhere. It's also, you're mandated to call. When I was in Hong Kong, by the way, in the protest, the protesters would take their lasers and shine them in the cameras and burn out the sensors. Actually, my camera got a little damaged by it. But that's not a long-term solution, obviously. But what I'm getting to is these smart cities are clearly coming, and they're already here to some degree every time we use our cards and that sort of thing. But they're clearly taking it to a higher level of complete control. And again, this isn't conspiratorial. They say they're going to do it. I mean, talk about Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of Netherlands. You can see Klaus Schwab going, where do you find such prime ministers as Mark Rutte? Did you see him say, I watch your Twitter, Jordan, and I watch a lot of your podcast. I know you know what's going on because you talk about it all the time.
The question is, what would be the effects of these materials on human health if they came down into the stratosphere, in particular small particles and aluminum?
So the collaborators of mine working on the aerosol scheme are actually folks from Carnegie Mellon who focused on human health impacts. And while we haven't published it, that was the very first thing we did, was do the order of magnitude calculation in a level pencil and paper, but with an expert on human health impacts about whether there could be an issue. And for aluminum or other particles, there are a lot of toxicological things that need to get looked at seriously. But if you're just thinking about the sheer number of particles and the human health impact of small particles, the answer is, well, we haven't published it. That was the first thing we looked at with some of the leading experts who do epidemiological research on human health impacts, and it's not even close to being an issue.
Clarify, so 10 megatons of aluminum dumped into the atmosphere would have no human health impact.
So let me be more careful here. To separate out the toxicological, so the alumina we've only begun to research and published nothing. Alumina we've only begun to research and published nothing.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do. An SAI program could limit global temperature increases, reducing some risks associated with higher temperatures and providing the world economy additional time to transition from fossil fuels. This process is also relatively inexpensive. The National Research Council estimates that a fully deployed SAI program would cost about $10 billion yearly. As promising as it may be, moving forward on SAI would also raise a number of challenges for our government and for the international community. On the technical side, greenhouse gas emission reductions would still have to accompany SAI to address other climate change effects, such as ocean acidification, because SAI alone would not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations. Others might seize on SAI's benefits and back away from their commitment to carbon dioxide reductions. And as with other breakthrough technologies, global norms and standards are lacking to guide the deployment and implementation of SAI and other geoengineering.
A World Economic Forum insider has blown the whistle and admitted that the globalist #1 goal is to implant CBDCs as a chip under the skin of every man, woman and child in the world, with or without their consent, and they will stop at nothing to achieve this aim. According to Professor Richard Werner, the globalist elite have been carefully planning this attack on humanity for decades, and they are now preparing to drop a cluster munition in the heart of civil society to soften people up so they will accept the chip. If anybody is qualified to talk about the evil agenda of the globalist elite, it's Richard Werner. As a rising economist and WEF Young Global Leader in the early 2000s, he was personally groomed by Klaus Schwab for a key role in the WEF. The future was bright for Werner, who, as a young global leader, had access to Klaus Schwab's contact list, including all the key strategic partners and stakeholders that Schwab likes to boast about. Werner worked with the Japanese government and invented quantitative easing. He published books that were picked up by major publishers and became bestsellers, much like Yuval Noah Harari in recent years. Life for Werner on the WEF gravy train was easy. Life was good. But then his conscience got in the way and he decided he couldn't continue working for the most evil people in the world and plotting the downfall of humanity. Since parting ways with the WEF and finding himself banned from Davos, every major institution in the world has declared him persona non grata. Cambridge University, one of the leading educational institutions in the world, offered him a job, only to retract it when they discovered that he was a Christian who believes big banks are a cancer on society. You might want to listen to what he's got to say. According to Werner, the globalist elite understand that there's a hurdle in getting people to implant a chip under their skin. So they are planning a series of disruptions and crises to prepare humanity to accept a universal basic income, also known as globalized communism, in which the chip will be necessary to receive your monthly stipend.
And several central banks apparently, as I heard from my sources, have already fully developed the final stage of CBDC. I mean, it comes in stages initially likely through your mobile phone, but that's only an intermediate step. And the final stage is, you know, it's small and it's the size of a grain of rice. Now, why is that?
And that grain of rice is your entire wallet, or? Yes,
it's your digital ID, your wallet, can be your passport, your key. What we found with our debit cards or credit cards is they've already now moved to the system, RFID chips, technology where you just wave the thing, contactless.
Yes,
that is sort of the conditioning us in this direction. That in the future you'll just wave your hand because you've got the microchip implant under your skin. Each step, there's a rational reason, it's easier just to wave this, isn't it? It's much faster because we always have to wait in the queues as everyone types in their numbers and all that. The next rationalization will be, well, but you can lose your card, somebody can steal your card, and then you're just waving, that's kind of risky. Well, wouldn't it be nice if you couldn't lose it and nobody could steal it? It's clear that that's it is almost a step too far for a lot of people because it is a violation of human dignity to actually inject something like that under the skin. So that's where you need some more persuasion.
Yeah.
This concept of universal basic income has been around for around a century, where everyone should get some kind of citizens, payment. Since 2015, they've all come out. I mean, all the big billionaires and World Economic Forum have come out, oh, this is a good idea, universal basic income. Well, why suddenly now? Because now we have the technology for the microchip implant. And so in 2017, Bill Gates came out and said that universal basic income is a good idea, but it's too early to introduce it. Now, what was still missing? So we had the technology for the microchip implant, but what was missing was the digital ID hadn't been introduced.
You wonder what's really behind this. Now, what's behind this is, of course, the powers that be. It's quite clear. It's a membership organization. So big business pays big money and writes the agenda of Davos, the World Economic Forum. But even big business is not as powerful as those who control money. And perhaps we should talk about that next. So, because really, any business industry, even pharmaceutical businesses that we found out, since 2020, extremely powerful and influential. But ultimately, the money power is even more powerful. And so in this hierarchy of power, that seems to be the key issue. Most people would think that the money comes from the government because that seems to make sense. And the government may delegate some of that to the central bank, but ultimately, it's a public function. It should be for the common good, for everyone. There should be fairness. And somehow the government just has to put the money into circulation. Well, the reality is, no government in the whole world is creating any money. The last major economy where the government said, actually, we're going to create money, and they put several $1 billion in circulation, was the US government under John F. Kennedy. So if the governments don't create money, who does it? Now, what JFK did in 1963 is he issued United States notes. They look exactly like the Federal Reserve notes, but same design, everything, except they weren't headed Federal Reserve notes, they were headed United States notes. And they didn't have the Fed seal, so it was a challenge to the Fed. But that's basically not happening anymore. It was an attempt. At the moment, or since then, what's been happening is that we have the central banks. But even the central banks only create a small amount of the money supply. Basically the paper money. Most people don't realize that we have been using digital money, digital currency for many decades. And that's part of the current, in this debate and discourse, obfuscation. They're saying, let's introduce central bank digital currency because it's a digital age. We need a digital response from central banks. Well, hang on. We've been using digital currency for a long time. Central bank money is only around 3% of the money supply, the paper money, the cash. 97% is digital money created by banks. And we've been using this for decades, so we actually have been using digital currency for a long time, and it works very well, and there's no problem with it. But now central banks will come to that. They're saying, hey, we need central bank digital currency. Well, why? But they want more power. I mean, that's quite obvious. The central banks want more power. But before we come to that, let's just understand the status quo, what's currently happening. Now, how do banks create money? Essentially, a banking license is a license to create money and put it into circulation. Did you know that when you study economics, particularly when you study it on a more advanced level, and maybe do a master's in economics or a doctorate, there's no banks. All the economic models, economic theories, they leave out banks. There's no banking in it. And of course, we know with hindsight, well, actually, that's a crucial function. These are the creators of the money supply. And if you leave those out, people don't really understand how it works. By coincidence. Convenient, isn't it? So how do banks put money into circulation? How do banks create money? When a bank gives out a loan, a bank loan, the money for the bank loan doesn't exist yet until you get the money paid to your account. That is the creation of new money. So effectively, banks don't lend money, they create money. And they create it when they do what we call a bank loan. So the money for a bank loan, which is the technical term is bank credit creation, that is new money creation. That newly adds to the money supply. So the more banks do what we call lending, normally, the more money is being created and added to the money supply. Now, of course, even though banks do this and they create the majority of the money supply through lending, central banks, of course, are very much aware of that. Today, if you look at the latest finance journals and finance textbooks, they all say, oh, banks are just financial intermediaries. They gather deposits, and the money they lend out is the deposit money they're lending out. which is not true. But you see, that's how they hide the reality of money creation. So already in March 2020, with some public statements about what they want to do. And surprise, surprise, they want to introduce CBDCs. So that is clearly one goal. Now, in order to introduce central bank digital currencies, what they need is digital IDs. Again, how do we introduce digital IDs? We need another excuse to do that. Well, the so-called pandemic delivered a great excuse. Well, at least they thought. I mean, it wasn't really very convincing, but somehow they argued that you needed to be injected with this experimental substance, and then somehow you need it in order to enter any restaurant or shop. So the justification wasn't very strong, but they definitely pushed these digital IDs, the so-called vaccine passports, very hard, and again in a coordinated fashion. So you see where this is going. And the goal is actually on the monetary side. That is the prize they're aiming for. We're talking about the most totalitarian control system in human history. Because this is a control tool that not only gives you, as a controller, complete visibility of what everyone is doing, every transaction. The money's moving from where to where, you know everything. But the monitoring is only one aspect. And of course, you can use that information for your purposes if you're the controller, the central planner. But actually, these CBDCs are programmable. And you can use tools, algorithms, big data algorithms, which they sell as artificial intelligence, in order to have rules about who can buy what for what purpose, at what time and at what place, where, and therefore control your movement, control all your activities. So you can see this. I mean, this in history, and also the human history of dictatorships, there's never been such a powerful control tool as they're about to introduce. And that is the big prize they're aiming for, I think.
This ice is from the Viking Age, around the year 1000, also called the medieval warm period. We believe that in Greenland, the medieval warm period was about 1.5 degrees warmer on average than today.
Nordgrip, the Greenland ice core project, is being reopened to drill the last few meters through the ice sheet to the rock beneath the research station. The ice core, over 3 kilometers in length, has been hauled up to the surface piece by piece and contains important data on the history of the climate of the Earth. It bears the fingerprints of climatic conditions over more than 120,000 years.
When we remove or drill the ice core, we leave a hole, and we insert a thermometer in the hole. We are able to map out the temperature through the 3-kilometer ice sheet. Now that temperature, if we do it precisely enough, a thousandth of a degree accuracy, then the ice has not forgotten how cold or warm it was on the surface at the time the snow fell. So, using those temperatures, we have been able to reconstruct the temperatures of the last 10,000 years. Here we have our picture of the temperature reconstructions that we have from Greenland in the graphical form. And if we go back along this axis, it's going back in time. This is the last 8,000 years we have plotted here. On this axis we have the temperatures at the site in Greenland, and we can see that if we go back from now about 4,000 years ago, we would have temperatures up here for about 4,000 years that were 2.5 degrees warmer on average than today. Now, as we approach our time, we can see that in the period between 4,000 years ago and back to the period 2,000 years ago, which is actually the Roman age, the temperatures have been decreasing in Greenland by 2.5 degrees. Then the temperatures increased gradually up to a maximum point around the medieval warm period, we call it 1,000 years ago. And then temperatures declined and goes down to a minimum around 1650 AD, comes back up a little in the 18th century, and then around 1875 we have the lowest point in the last 8,000 years, right here, and that matches exactly the time when meteorological observations started.
Other core samples from elsewhere in Greenland confirm that the Little Ice Age ended about 140 years ago, at the coldest point in the last 10,000 years. The natural, pronounced alteration of warm and cold periods back in time has also been confirmed elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere. Carbon-14 dating of organic matter from peat bogs and tree rings confirms the pattern. So do data from stalactite caves in China and measurements from North Africa.
The problem is that and I agree completely that we have had a global temperature increase in the 20th century. Yes. But an increase from what? Probably an increase from the lowest point we've had for the last 10,000 years. And this means that it will be very hard indeed to prove whether the increase of temperature in the 20th century was man-made or it's a natural variation. That will be very hard because we made ourselves an extremely poor experiment. We started to observe meteorology at the coldest spot in the last 10,000 years.
The Matrix was created as a prison for your mind, so that when your enemies wanted to enslave you in a real prison, a digital 15-minute city prison, that you would accept it. They are herding the cattle into the barns, and there is not enough space in these barns for all the cattle. So your masters decided some livestock needed to be culled. Turn off your television set and wake up now.